there's a lot of things here, and I give you the regulations and, you know, every person in the U.S. who becomes involved in an export transaction as principal agent or freight forwarder is subject to the requirements for record keeping. So even though that Jennifer is asked me to move her shipment for her, and she's given me a power of attorney, I am just as responsible as she is to make sure that I keep my records. So, and let me tell you how that normally would work. If the government inspects that in shipment, they're going to first come to IMAC. And they're going to ask for you, and they're going to go through your records. You're the first person they'll go to. Then they're going to say, oh, you had Mike help you out? Can I have his contact information? Then they're going to come to me and say, you did this shipment for IMAC. We would like to see the paperwork. So paperwork trail has to go with every principal agent that touches that shipment here in the United States. Okay, any questions on that? Okay. Identifies specific records that must be maintained, the general rule being that all records must be maintained for 5 years following the last export date or last known re-export transshipment date. Okay? 5 years. Now, the best thing that I can tell a company is get a good best practices. All right? Whatever it is. Sometimes companies hire people to give them best practices. Sometimes companies come up with them themselves. I really don't care. Just make sure that you have something in writing as a best practice to the way you handle things. Let me give you the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario. All right? Candy's been in her job for 30 years, and everybody relies on Candy. Everybody. And you know what? For 30 years, she's never let anything fall through the cracks. Great. Everybody is all over. They love her. Okay? Something goes wrong. When the government comes in, they're going to ask. They're going to ask Rick. Rick, what do you know about this? Don't ask me. Candy takes care of it. Okay? They'll go to another coworker. What do you know about it? I probably know less than Rick knows. Candy takes care of it. Okay, where's Candy? Oh, Candy's on vacation this week. Okay, that's the worst scenario that can happen. And I can tell you that this whole thing was brought on because Candy just made a simple error. She made an error like, what was your port of departure? And instead of putting Long Beach, she put Chicago. There's not too many steamships that are leaving out of Chicago. You might be sending your product on a train that goes from Buffalo to Chicago to Long Beach that gets ported, but she mistakenly put Chicago. It's a very simple mistake, right? But Candy has everything in her head, and we come to visit her, and she's on vacation, and I'm now getting irritated because I got to come back, so, and, nothing in writing. And I'm the guy that's going to decide if you get her fine or not? And when I finally do get to meet with her, she's going to say, well, can't we mitigate this because it was just a simple mistake? I'm going to look at her and I'm going to say, I just met you. How do I know that for 30 years you've been doing this right? How do I know that you really know what you're doing? See where that comes into play? Now let's reverse that. And let's say Candy again makes a simple mistake. And she puts the wrong port of departure on the paperwork. And I come in and I say, Rick, what do you know about this? And Rick says, you know what? I'm really not sure about that specific shipment because I didn't do it. But what I can tell you is this is how we handle shipments. And here's our best practices. And I can't really talk for Candy today because she's on vacation. But if a shipment came out today while she's on vacation, this is the way I would handle it. Okay, well, let me come back and I'll talk with Candy. So now I come back and she's back from vacation and I say, Candy, how do you handle this? She says, let me pull out my book. Even though she doesn't need to because she's been doing it for 30 years, she knows it backwards and forwards, but she pulls out the book. And she tells me, you know what, Mike, I just made an error here. And the reason that I could prove to you that it's an error because I tell you right here in our best practices the way we're supposed to handle it. I just missed it. You're probably getting a slap on the wrist for that. See the difference? It has nothing to do with Candy's capability. It has nothing to do with her knowledge. It has nothing to do with how long she's been with the company. But that's what I hear all the time. It has to do with the snapshot of when things go wrong. Okay? So record keeping is very important. Best practices, how you keep those records, how you do things is very important. Go ahead.
On that issue there, does that internal document, that process document, does that need to be revision controlled at all?
Yes, it does. Yes. Okay. The question is, revision controlled for that you don't understand what that means is that document might be produced 4 or 5 different places. Okay? Or maybe Rick has a copy, Candy has a copy. And Candy updates it. But Rick doesn't get the revision. That's what you're talking about, right? Okay? There has to be some kind of a process that says we're using our standard operating policy dated such and such. And this is how we know that Rick has the same process that Candy has. Is it one book? That's easier. Or do you have 2 books? But it has to be documented. Did that answer your question? Okay? Any questions about record keeping? The other thing, and we're going to talk a little bit at the end of class when we talk about Incoterms, and the majority of the companies that export in the United States use Ex Works, meaning they let their foreign customer deal with everything. Okay? Another problem there is where is all the paperwork? Who handles the paperwork? And believe me, when the government comes in and says, in the last year you've made 20 exported shipments, can I see the paperwork? And you tell the agent, well, I really don't have it. Let me contact every one of my customers and try and get the paperwork back. That's not going to work real well. Okay? You produced it, you sold it, you export it, you have to own up to it. Keep the paperwork, keep the documentation. Make sure everything is correct. All right? Rick, does this area fall under you and your division? Yeah, Russell, I'm sorry.
We use it'll be brokered, but I oversee the shipping side of it. We do keep records.
So you keep your records. You're responsible for record keeping.
We have shipping records.
Okay?
We keep them off-site as well as on-site.
You know, and one of the things that I suggest that you do that goes a long way with the government if you make a mistake is say, I'd just like to do an internal audit. Let's take the last 3 months, and I want to see, is the paperwork correct for all our shipments over the last 3 months? And do your own internal audit, okay? And if you do that audit and you find something that's wrong, okay, the very first thing you should do is go to your counsel. Go to your lawyer, tell them this is what we did wrong. We found it on our own audit. And then they'll self-disclose it to the government. Okay? If you do an audit and you don't find anything wrong, and the government comes in and audits you again behind that, that's a plus in your favor. You're showing them that you have procedures. You have record keeping, you have standards, and you audit those standards to make sure that they're being followed. That goes a long way. And let me tell you, it goes a long way when you get a letter from the government that says you're being fined $100,000, okay? And you can mitigate it down to $500. It's a long way. And the difference between that $100,000 and that $5,000 is your procedures. What was your intent that day in the shipment? Was Candy trying to deliberately falsify that document by putting departure Chicago? Or was it a mistake and we could justify her intent was just a mistake? And here's the documents to prove it.